Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On the program this week, we'll talk all things asylum. Trump administration regulations run into roadblocks, what's happening with the country of first entry agreement with Guatemala, and remain in Mexico. Before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. Now to the program. And here with me today are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Theresa, welcome back.
Hey, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hey, Cris.
Hey, Jordan. Hey, how's it going?
Good. All right, let's start before we get into the main events today with some news that just broke before we came in here in the studio. BuzzFeed and others are reporting that ICE today arrested 680 undocumented immigrants at a worksite in Mississippi, and they're suggesting it might be the largest ever single-state immigration enforcement operation. Theresa, your thoughts on this news?
Sure. Well, I think it wasn't at one work site. I think it was at several work sites. ICE announced earlier that they had conducted a operation across several work sites in Mississippi of food processing centers where they had executed search warrants for documents and also encountered and apprehended undocumented immigrants. This is, as far as we can tell, one of the largest workplace enforcement efforts that ICE has undertaken recently. 680 migrants apprehended. That's a very, probably close to maybe the largest they've done in one single operation. As I recall, the same story mentioned about 280 were apprehended all of last year. So it's a pretty significant worksite enforcement effort targeted at, I think, a particular employer or set of employers in Mississippi.
Yeah, I think the quick thing to for the education for readers, I think it's Homeland Security Investigations that does a lot of these raids.
Yeah, the worksite enforcement, they're part of ICE, yeah. And it's a law enforcement activity. There's search warrants for documents. They're looking for evidence that the employers knew that the workers were undocumented, but obviously also to apprehend the undocumented workers themselves.
So we talked on the last episode about the promised immigration raids that were to happen in cities. Is this part of that effort?
Unclear. These kind of operations usually take a long time to develop. They're looking for, again, it's Homeland Security Investigations. It's not enforcement and removal, which is conducting the other ones. This wasn't targeted at families the way the other one was supposed to be. This probably took many months of investigation to build up enough to get search warrants for the place. Again, these were criminal search warrants executed, as well as document requests. So there's a lot more to this than I think what the raids that President Trump was talking about. This was probably had been in the works for quite some time. But, similar to those other kind of raids, anytime one of these things happen, certainly immigrant communities in that area are going to be scared and afraid of other collateral operations. I have 680 individuals in custody, and of course, all the collateral impacts on their families and communities, et cetera. Usually when these things happen, because people are at work, there could be families impacted. There could be kids that may or may not have somebody at home to come home to. So these are the kinds of stories that we're likely to see in the follow-up to this. Also, the impact on these operations of these employers. Even if they did not have knowledge that these people were undocumented, they've now lost significant portions of their workforce. That will devastate local communities that rely on those jobs and those companies for economic benefit. So there's disruption that happens with these enforcement actions.
All right, let's turn to asylum issues. We talked at the start of the last episode about how new Trump administration asylum rules that would bar most migrants from claiming asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border if they first traveled through another country, like Guatemala or Mexico. When we first recorded that episode, one federal judge had declined to stop those rules from going into effect. But since then, another federal judge has issued an injunction, meaning this policy can't take effect for right now. Theresa, can you break down the latest ruling for me? What did the judge say in issuing this injunction?
Sure. So the judge in California, Judge Tigar, is the same judge that had issued an injunction against the first iteration of the asylum ban that you can't apply if you're applying between the ports of entry. And he used similar arguments that this was beyond the scope of authority of the law, and that they didn't do it by appropriate rulemaking, that it was an emergency rulemaking. Interestingly enough, the government appealed back to the judge to stay his ruling, his injunction, while they could appeal, and the judge denied that, saying that the arguments the government made to stay were the same arguments they made against the injunction in the first place that he disagreed with, and so he wasn't going to stay his injunction, which means that they are prevented from implementing this asylum ban, third country asylum ban, while this case proceeds on appeal.
So more broadly, the Trump administration has faced a lot of difficulty in making changes to the rules around asylum. Why?
Well, partially because they're putting out rules very quickly. They are exploring new legal arguments to support those regulations and doing things that previous administrations have not done. So it's testing new legal ground and pushing legal envelopes. And if you recall, when this latest asylum regulation was issued, even Mark Morgan, the acting director of CBP, said, look, we expect this is going to be sued. So the administration knows that these are all going to be challenged. They're trying to put it out there anyway in the hopes that at least some of them will be put in place. Remember, Remain in Mexico was also challenged in courts, and that was not enjoined. So even if some of these things are allowed to be put in place, the Trump administration believes that it's a win for them on a policy level. The other thing is they keep saying that the original travel ban way back from 2017, when it finally got to the Supreme Court, was upheld. And so they have a firm belief that eventually everything they're trying to do will be upheld in the Supreme Court. It's just a long road from here to there. And in the meantime, they're just throwing, it's like spaghetti against the wall. We will throw every possible thing we know how to do or could possibly think to do with our existing authority out there to see what we can stick and what will have an impact.
I think one quick thing to think about is really when the history of this period is written is how much jurisprudence is going to be coming out on asylum from this period in the administration, because a lot of these things that the Trump administration is trying to do is going into these new legal grounds. I think it's going to be really interesting for legal historians to sort of assess this, because we're entering to new grounds, new waters that hadn't been tested. And if you think about the INA, it's always there are parts of it that haven't been enforced or haven't been fully explored. And I think right now it's going to be an interesting perspective to see this in hindsight once all this is said and done. But maybe that's one of the great legacies of the Trump administration, is giving legal scholars more work to do down the road.
Well, and that brings up another point, Theresa. As you mentioned, this is the same federal judge who halted a different asylum ban 1.0, last year, while a Trump-appointed judge had previously declined to prevent this latest ban from taking effect a couple of weeks ago. So you've both you and Cris, have talked about and written about the peril of letting courts decide such vast swaths of immigration law. Is this just another example of the problems with that approach? Are there risks associated with that?
There are risks, and I think Cris pointed out some of them, that at least some of these cases, as they go through the process, will create judicial precedents that are about areas of asylum law that maybe haven't been dealt with before. And, for asylum advocates, if those judicial precedents go against or go in favor of the Trump administration, that's now set law, and that's problematic for them. The other half of this is a lot of these cases hinge on the Administrative Procedures Act, which is a general law that applies to how the government can regulate things, and the notice and comment provisions it has to do, and when it has to give deference to people who've relied on previous decisions. Was it arbitrary and capricious what they did, and was it outside the scope of their authority under law? Those kind of arguments are used against federal actions every day in every sort of area of administration that you can think of. Those arguments, even if they rule against the Trump administration or against the plaintiffs, are less likely to have a lasting effect on the substance of immigration law. So much will depend on how these decisions are finally decided. Are they decided on the immigration law part, on the constitutional application, or are they decided on administrative procedure law? To give an example, the DACA cases. Most of those right now hinge on whether or not the administration correctly followed administrative procedure in ending that program, not whether or not they had the authority to do so. So when the Supreme Court takes that up, even if they say, hey, you did it wrong, that doesn't prevent the administration from doing it again and doing it right and ending the program. So again, the limitations of litigation are what are the bases of the decisions going to be, and will they have far-reaching impacts on the immigration law? And or two, is it just something where the administration did it too fast and too quick, but if they did it a different way, they'd still be able to implement their policy? So you get a temporary reprieve, there's no permanent solutions, or you could get bad law that affects a lot of things going forward. So you're always taking a chance when you go into the courts, and you're never quite sure how it's going to come out.
Yeah, because we've seen hints of this actually with the Supreme Court ruling on the citizenship question for the census. That essentially what they were kind of saying was what the argument you presented wasn't entirely in line with what the underlying facts, but if you present it in a different way, maybe you have a case. And they think that that's sort of, I think that's the kind of the problem with the strategy the advocates have been using with these lawsuits. Is more not dealing with the substance of the law, but kind of dealing with more the procedural components. And I think the Supreme Court will definitely be sensitive to that if and when these cases arrive.
The last thing I would say is that now that the courts have been brought in essentially to the political debate around immigration, the way these cases are talked about, the advocates will claim that, they're make a lot of claims about the legality of something based on a preliminary decision and say how this is all against the law, and the Trump administration go off and the Trump is going to say these are frivolous lawsuits. All of those things that the advocates and attorneys are saying about the lawsuits aren't necessarily the basis on which you should evaluate how those lawsuits are going to go. That's spin. And both sides are trying to spin their arguments. But the judges hopefully are ruling on the basis of the evidence presented, the testimony, and the facts and the law. And again, that means that no matter how many times somebody claims that something is legal or illegal, ultimately the judges will determine that.
So meanwhile, Senator Lindsey Graham, the South Carolina Republican who chairs the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, controversially waived committee rules to push through an asylum bill of his own. That bill would increase the number of days a family can be held in detention together from 20 to 100 days and would set up regional processing centers in Mexico and Central America for asylum claims. It would also provide funding for 500 new immigration judges. We just touted on the last episode that there were some signs of bipartisanship around immigration in recent weeks, and now this acrimonious episode has happened. What does this action say about where the parties stand on working together on issues about immigration?
So I think what it says is there are still places where they're far apart. And when it comes to figuring out how to deal with the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly the asylum claims and the asylum process, the parties are still very, very far apart. And certainly the influence of President Trump is seen here. He has been increasingly frustrated that Congress has not acted to change laws around who can apply for asylum, how people can be detained, etc. And again, that's one of the reasons why he's tried to throw all these regulatory actions out there that have been enjoined by the courts. So Lindsey Graham, who is now a friend of Trump, is trying to push what the Trump administration wants. His bill is everything pretty much the Trump administration has asked for. It is very partisan, and the Democrats have said, no, this isn't how we want to proceed. However, the Democrats have also refused essentially to come to the table to debate any changes to the asylum system. And so Graham being frustrated when he tried to bring up the bill and none of the Democrats showed except the ranking member Dianne Feinstein, under the committee rules, they couldn't proceed to consider the bill. And so he's like, look, you're refusing to come to the table to even try to have a committee process to try to be bipartisan about this. So if you're not even going to try, why should I? And he moved it. It doesn't help the future of immigration issues that have to go through this committee. There's going to have to be some fences mended. Judiciary Committee under previous chairs of both Republicans and Democrats had been a place where bipartisanship could happen, even on immigration. The former chair, Orrin Hatch, was known to work across the aisle. Even Chuck Grassley would work across the aisle. With Patrick Leahy, who was the ranking member for a very long time. Graham is certainly taking a different approach. And it's unclear how the fences are going to be mended here. Even his longtime compatriot, Dick Durbin, who they co-sponsored many versions of the DREAM Act, is saying this isn't the way to run a ship. So at least on this issue, I think what they're saying is that, when it comes to changing asylum rules to deter people or to keep kids in custody longer, that's not something Democrats want to engage in. But again, unless they're willing to come to the table and talk about other alternatives, it's unclear where anything goes.
Yeah, I think the thing to think about, in the last episode, we were talking about changes to the employment-based system. And I think that really comes down to it being just a less emotionally tense issue, I think. Asylum, I think, brings up so many strong emotions on both sides about what should be done and how we handle this that I think it makes it a little bit harder for both sides to be able to kind of think more clearly on like what should be done. Employment-based immigration is in some ways almost technocratic. It is very technocratic, administrative. You're thinking technically like what are the individuals and what are the qualifications and how should they come? And I think that that's easier to come to an agreement over a very technocratic issue. And the irony, of course, is that an asylum system is also inherently technocratic. It's not that it's any different. It's still, part in the fabric of the immigration laws that we have here. I think that just the emotion around it with what's been happening at the southern border has made it hard for both parties to kind of see it as a technocratic issue that can have tweaks, can have changes in the same way that our employment-based system is, but our politics aren't there.
Well, I'd also say that President Trump and his efforts to, forcibly push changes to and make things that do enforcement actions that have roundly been criticized for both sides of the aisle, like the zero tolerance family separation policy, even the threats against Mexico and Guatemala to get these agreements that essentially prevent people from applying for asylum. They're seeing him take these really extreme actions, and they're concerned that any changes Congress might make would empower him more rather than limit him. And that's an ongoing debate. The president has not shown himself respectful of limitations that Congress has put on him. For example, the wall funding that he went and did emergency. So Democrats have some reason to be skeptical that even if Congress were to pass a bipartisan law that puts some limits on what he wants to do, but also makes changes, that wouldn't be enough for him, or he'd simply ignore it. So I think there's a lack of trust all around on these issues right now, and particularly how the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border has been treated, how the asylum system has been treated, and the things that the President Trump has demanded have just been very difficult to get any sort of calmer discussion and dialogue going. But that's also meaning that nothing substantively is changing at the border, and the conditions are still very, very bad. And so I think it's incumbent upon Congress to kind of get past all that and try to legislate here, because I think, as I said before, if nothing changes, nothing will change, and we'll continue to have the same situation that we have, and the administration will continue to do harsher and harsher things to try to address it.
Okay, after the break, we'll take a look at the Trump administration's regional migration strategy. The Trump administration late last month trumpeted an agreement with Guatemala's government that would require migrants who pass through Guatemala on their way to the United States to first seek asylum there in Guatemala. And if they hadn't done so, they would be sent back there, whether they were Guatemalan citizens or not. But Cris, now there are questions about just what exactly was agreed to and how both countries are going to operationalize this agreement. How are both sides hashing out the details at this point?
So, last time in this week in immigration, we talked about the policy and basically said it may not be happening because the Guatemalan president tried to sign an agreement and the Guatemalan Constitutional Court said, no, you cannot sign this agreement without consulting the Guatemalan legislature. Well, what happened is a week later that this agreement was signed. And the big mystery is what was agreed to. We just don't know. The Guatemalan government put out a Spanish language version of the agreement, but we, I think as of this recording, have not seen an English language version. We haven't seen any type of indication of what they might look like. I believe there might be reports, I believe from maybe Jonathan Blitzer from the New Yorker or Ramón Taylor from Voice of America that might have seen some of these agreements, or at least seen some text. But it's all a great mystery aside from the basic operation, which is, if you're a non-citizen who traveled through Guatemala and arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border seeking asylum, that then you would be returned to Guatemala to apply for asylum there. But that's kind of the basic broad brush of what we know, but there's a lot that we don't know.
Some Guatemalan lawmakers have raised a lot of concerns that their country just simply isn't prepared to do what's being required in this agreement. What are their concerns?
I mean, I'm holding my breath because it's the system really is understaffed. I've been talking about for the last 6 months or so on this podcast and the work that we do about the fact that the Mexican asylum system doesn't have enough staff, enough offices to receive the number of asylum seekers that have been coming there and seeking protection. Guatemala makes them look like they have a wealth of resources. I think right now they have 8 asylum officers. Last year they received 227 asylum applications. And now all of a sudden they're going to have to turn on a dime and receive however many number of migrants coming in from Honduras and El Salvador, but other countries as well if they travel through Guatemala. So I've been saying this, Guatemala and Mexico don't have the capacity to be able to fulfill these types of agreements. So I think, when you really look at the hard facts, it's really, really questionable whether or not they're going to be able to implement this. This is I think one of the key problems that they're going to face when it comes to implementing this. It's not just simply the details, it's more how can you do it.
And the U.S. side has issues as well, even if, first of all, we know that there's a lawsuit already getting ready to go against this. We're not sure it's actually been implemented at all on the U.S. side. The U.S. law requires a Safe Third Agreement to be a bilateral or multilateral agreement. So until it's ratified in Guatemala, it's not bilateral, regardless of who signed it. But also, it's unclear what process would happen with people at the border. So, for example, under the U.S.-Canada Safe Third Agreement, there's a process where someone who comes into the country, asks to apply for asylum, has an interview with an asylum officer to first see if they qualify for repatriation under the U.S.-Canada Safe Third Agreement, or if they meet one of the exceptions to that, and then do they have a fear of returning to Canada. And there are several exceptions to the U.S.-Canada Safe Third, including whether somebody already has family members in the country. That would exempt them from being sent back. I don't think that there's necessarily anything in the Guatemala agreement like that, at least not that's been reported or in the little bit that we've seen. And the U.S. and it applies to nationals of any country. But what process will happen at the U.S.-Mexico border? Will we have more asylum officers down there? Right now, there's not enough to do the cases they have. So that's, and again, we still have capacity issues. They have to be held somewhere until that can happen. They're not going to be sent back right away. So all of the issues we have with the facilities at the border, the places migrants are being held, are not going to be alleviated by this unless or until it's successful in either deterring people from coming or sending people back.
Yeah, and I think the quick thing to add with there is it's a regulation. Yeah. That's an implementation of what's already in the Immigration Nationality Act, but it's a regulation and it needs to be implemented. It has to go through the rule and commenting process. That's, we were just talking about this a moment ago, how the administration really has not been faring well with regulations. So, it's going to have to be implemented somehow. And like Theresa said, there will be a lawsuit coming down for sure.
Well, and in the meantime, you raised the question of whether the Guatemalan Congress will actually ratify this agreement.
I mean, that's the open question, right? We're a few months out from the presidential elections. Definitely there's a lot of opposition, not only in the Guatemalan Congress, but you've also started seeing more human rights advocates in the country protesting this. There's always the threat that Trump had over Jimmy Morales of taxings on remittances or tariffs or a whole host of things I think are handing over that. But I think, the Guatemalan Congress might just be looking at this and say, you know what, let's leave this to the next president. Let's let our electoral process play out. Right now, I think we haven't seen a lot of movement towards saying we're just going to deny this. But I think the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot happening, I think, within Guatemala. And I think people will start looking at this more seriously.
Okay, let's turn to one of the Trump administration's other major regional efforts, the Migrant Protection Protocols, or what we know better as the Remain in Mexico program. A number of reports last month indicated that the Trump administration intends to expand that program to a larger swath of border territory. Meanwhile, concerns are mounting about the safety of migrants who are being sent to Mexico to await their day in court. Where do things stand right now with the expansion of Remain in Mexico?
Well, theoretically, it's been expanded across the U.S.-Mexico border. So we have seen reports that even in South Texas and some of the smaller cities, migrants have been returned across the border, including places like Matamoros. And those are much more dangerous places. Ciudad Juarez, which is across from El Paso, is another place where, there are warnings for U.S. citizens going to these places, how dangerous it may be. And the migrants are more vulnerable than even Americans would be going into these places. Obviously, they don't have places to live. A lot of these communities are small. They don't have migrant shelters. And so there are a lot of reports of migrants who are encountering kidnappings or extortion or robberies or assaults and other things happening while they're in Mexico. The latest report that we've seen is that the Mexican government is now requiring migrants to get on buses and be bused to the south of Mexico rather than waiting in these border towns. They'd be bused all the way back down to Chiapas, which is near the Guatemalan border, which is where Mexico would like them to stay because they think that there's more employment opportunities down there maybe. But the fact of the matter is that it'll be very difficult for migrants to make their way back to the U.S. border when it's time for their immigration hearings. So again, it's worth noting, since we've been talking about litigation all podcast, this is another one of Trump's programs that is under litigation, but there has not been an injunction against it so far. So one of the questions that would happen, I think, is that if a judge eventually rules against this process, how do all these migrants get back to have their day in court? This is going to be a real problem to figure out.
Yeah, and then of course the other theme from this podcast is implementation. Advocates have been incredibly frustrated by the fact that there doesn't seem to be much coordination for individuals who have to, if they're being bused down to South Mexico, how they have to appear at a port of entry in order to enter the country, then actually get transported to the immigration court for their hearing, and then if they have to be returned back to Mexico, then they have to go back to the coordination is very problematic here. So there's a lot of questions as to like whether or not this is a viable way of sort of managing the number of individuals entering the immigration court docket.
Well, also the access to counsel, right? So, immigrants in immigration court are entitled to have an attorney of their own choosing if they can find one. It's extremely difficult for migrants who are in Mexico to locate American pro bono attorneys who can come talk to them. Even in border towns where theoretically the attorneys could just cross the border and meet with them. But in southern Mexico, it's going to be impossible. And so this is essentially another way of limiting the ability of these people to effectuate their immigration claims and asylum claims in immigration court.
Yeah, and I think what we've been seeing is there's been reporting, I believe Los Angeles Times had a piece the other day about individuals who have just sort of been frustrated with this whole process who are returning back to Central America. Obviously, we don't have hard numbers. I don't think that data is gathered by Mexico or the United States, but that's kind of one of those, the unsighted goal of this policy really is that.
Right. The Trump administration would say that's the point, correct?
Yeah, I think they would say that's the point. And they don't seem to be caring too much about what happens to the individuals in the meantime.
So the Mexican government has tacitly accepted this arrangement thus far, but obviously they're struggling to figure out how to make it work on their side of the border. And what's domestic reaction been like thus far?
So this is actually one of those mysteries where reporting has said that Mexico, throughout this whole process, has been in discussions with the United States, how they're presenting, how they view remain in Mexico. They're trying to say it's a more limited scope of program. It's only for certain numbers of asylum seekers or certain asylum seekers, but in reality, we know this just applies to anybody who's arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. So they've been trying to kind of play it both ways. The implementation part, obviously, that they're trying to sort of play a role in managing this. But like we were just saying, busing migrants down to Chiapas or southern Mexico, is just going to make the implementation just a lot harder. But in terms of domestic policy, the Mexican government's trying to do this. And what is the domestic reaction? There's been poll after poll that has really shown that a lot of the Mexican public wants the Mexican government to really clamp down on migration. And I think the way that the Mexican government has been handling this gives them the impression that it's not being managed well, if it's being managed at all. And I think that they would rather just see these individuals be returned to their home countries if we're looking at the writing on the wall and what people really want.
At the same time, the Mexican government is insisting still that they will not negotiate a safe third country agreement. If you recall, when the Mexican agreement was announced, Trump said he had a safe third country agreement. Mexico said no. He said, well, I have a secret, secondary protocol that will kick in if these other things that Mexico does don't work. And Mexico's saying, hey, they have worked. The number of migrants to the U.S.-Mexico border has gone down. Look at everything we've done. We don't need to go there, and we're not going to go there. So it's literally reads like they're trying to figure out how do they placate the Trump administration enough that they don't have to go to the safe third, which I think domestically for them would be disastrous, but still are responding enough that the Trump administration says, oh, okay, we're a good partner, we won't threaten the tariffs and other things. They're really trying to walk a fine line, both in foreign policy with the U.S. government and in its domestic politics. But Cris, you said something on Twitter that I think bears repeating here, which is Mexico was the first country the United States had encountered to try to address the migration situation. And they had an opportunity to lead a regional discussion, to bring in the Northern Triangle countries, and essentially have 4 or 5 countries negotiating with the United States rather than one-on-one, and they didn't do that. AMLO went in saying, I want a regional migration compact, I want regional development, this is what I want to do. And it turned out he's got nothing of that, and now he has no leverage over the United States to try to go do that. And so in some ways they've sort of inadvertently or advertently abdicated that kind of regional leadership role they could have had.
Yeah, and some people respond to that tweet that I put out saying, well, there's conflict among the different heads of state. There's elites may not line up for it. But at the end of the day, a regional discussion, we've seen plenty of regional negotiations and multilateral agreements come up with where heads of state did not agree on much, or even they personally disliked each other. Case in point, the EU. So, but the thing is here is that still, though, there are aligned national interests that could have led, I think, to having a regional dialogue about this, and that you could have had this agreement one and done in the region. There would have been, I think, maybe a better effort for coordination, at least, with the implementation of a first entry regional agreement. But, there just has been an absolute absence of leadership coming in from Mexico, which is seen as a regional power, at least in this part of Latin America. And it's surprising not to see that they were really more proactive in this area.
All right, so a lot of news this week. I think that's a good place, though, to leave it. Theresa, Cris, thanks for joining me, and thanks to you all for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Chris Ramón and myself and produced by Yafat Tawahara. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.